What the hell is this? Who let this guy into my boardroom?
I'm here for the investors. Pleasure to meet you, sir.
You people walk in here acting important. This is a serious company, not some street corner operation. I don't care who invited you. You do not belong here. Get out of my boardroom! Right now!
The most expensive mistake Richard Whitmore ever made lasted only 3 seconds, and it began with a hand he thought was beneath him. On the 47th floor of Veyron Biotech's glass headquarters in Manhattan, the morning sun poured through the windows and turned the conference table into a long strip of polished silver. 14 executives sat around it in charcoal suits and navy ties, their tablets open, their coffee untouched, their eyes shifting toward the door every few seconds because everyone in that room understood what was at stake. On the wall-sized screen behind the CEO's chair, 6 words glowed in clean blue letters: Final funding meeting, $200 million. It looked like a celebration waiting to happen, but beneath the expensive carpet and quiet air conditioning hum, the whole company was holding its breath. Then the door opened. Malcolm Hayes stepped in without rushing, a tall black man in a simple black suit, carrying no flashy briefcase, wearing no watch that begged to be noticed, followed only by his assistant, Angela Brooks, who held a slim leather folder against her chest like it contained something heavier than paper. Malcolm paused just inside the doorway, taking in the room with calm, steady eyes. He noticed the way one board member glanced past him, searching for someone who looked more like the man he expected. He noticed the way the general counsel leaned toward the CFO and whispered, "Is that him?" He noticed the way Richard Whitmore, founder and CEO of Veyron Biotech, stayed seated a moment too long before rising with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Richard was 56, silver-haired, polished, and famous for making people feel small without ever raising his voice. He walked around the head of the table as though the room belonged not to the company but to him personally. Malcolm approached him with quiet professionalism and extended his hand. For one brief second, the gesture hung there, ordinary and human. For the second second, everyone saw Richard's eyes drop to Malcolm's hand and stay there. For the third second, the room changed. Richard did not take it. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the insult visible, then gave a thin smile and said, "I don't think we're there yet." No one moved. The CFO, Claire Bennett, lowered her eyes to the folder in front of her as if she had just watched a fuse catch fire. Angela's jaw tightened, but Malcolm's expression did not shift. He simply held his hand there for one more heartbeat, long enough for every person in the room to understand that he knew exactly what had happened, then slowly lowered it to his side. Richard turned toward the table, already pretending the moment had meant nothing. "Shall we begin?" he said. Malcolm looked at the glowing number on the screen, $200 million, then looked back at Richard with a calm so complete it made the air feel colder. What Richard did not know was that he had not refused a courtesy. He had refused the last bridge between his company and the collapse waiting underneath it. The silence after Richard's words did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, stretched across the conference table, and settled into the corners of the room where people pretended not to notice what they had just seen. Richard moved first, because men like him believed motion could erase meaning. He returned to his chair at the head of the table, straightened his cuffs, and gave the room the confident smile he used on magazine covers and earnings calls. "We have a full agenda," he said, tapping one finger against the polished wood. "Let us respect everyone's time." Malcolm Hayes took the seat reserved for him halfway down the table, not beside Richard, not even near the center, but 3 chairs from the end, where someone had placed a visitor badge and a bottle of room-temperature water. Angela Brooks sat to his right and opened the leather folder without a word. Across from them, Claire Bennett kept her eyes on the financial packet in front of her, but her hand had gone still on the page. She knew the numbers better than anyone. Veyron Biotech had 11 days of operating cash left. 11 days before payroll became a problem. 11 days before the bank stopped returning calls. 11 days before the public story of innovation and market confidence cracked open and showed the panic underneath. The $200 million was not growth capital, no matter what Richard called it. It was oxygen. Without it, the company would not simply slow down. It would start suffocating. Richard clicked the remote, and the screen shifted to a clean presentation slide filled with bright charts, projected revenue curves, and photographs of smiling patients in hospital rooms. His voice became warm and rehearsed. Veyron is not just a company, he said. It is a mission. We are standing at the edge of a breakthrough that could change cardiac care across America. Several board members nodded, not because the words moved them, but because they had heard them so many times they knew where to place their faces. Malcolm listened quietly. He did not interrupt. He watched the rhythm of the room, the way Richard spoke over Claire whenever she tried to add detail, the way the legal counsel avoided eye contact when risk was mentioned, the way every number on the slide seemed polished until it barely resembled fear. Then Richard turned toward Malcolm with a smile just sharp enough to cut. Our friends from Hayes Capital have already seen the fundamentals, he said. So today should be less of a debate and more of a final alignment. Angela looked up. Malcolm remained still. Before any final alignment, Malcolm said, his voice calm and even, I would like to understand why the updated trial cost projections were not included in the board packet. A small shift moved around the table. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to discomfort. Richard's smile stayed in place, but his eyes hardened. Those figures are being refined. By how much? Malcolm asked. Claire inhaled quietly. Richard leaned back, folding his hands. Mr. Haywood, with respect, this is a high-level strategic session. We do not need to get buried in operational noise. Angela's pen stopped moving. Malcolm looked directly at Richard. Hayes, he said. My name is Malcolm Hayes. Richard gave a small laugh, the kind designed to make correction seem like sensitivity. Of course. Malcolm. Then he turned toward Angela instead of him. Perhaps you can help us keep the process moving. Angela did not answer immediately. She looked to Malcolm, because everyone in the room was supposed to understand where the authority sat. But Richard did not understand. Or worse, he did, and chose not to care. Malcolm placed one hand lightly on the closed folder in front of him. His face gave away nothing, but something in the room tightened. The handshake had been the first warning. The wrong name was the second. And Claire Bennett, staring down at 11 days of cash on a spreadsheet, suddenly realized there might not be a third. Claire Bennett had spent 15 years reading rooms before they became disasters, and this one was beginning to feel like a glass tower built on a fault line. She was 44, precise, disciplined, and not easily shaken, but as Richard continued his presentation, she could feel the company's future slipping away one polished insult at a time. The worst part was that no one outside the room would have guessed it. From the street below, Veyron Biotech looked untouchable, a 47-story monument to American ambition, with its silver logo mounted above the lobby and its name scrolling across business channels as if success were already guaranteed. Inside, the truth was less beautiful. The company had delayed 2 vendor payments. The clinical trial expansion in Phoenix was running $19 million over budget. A loan covenant review was due Friday. The payroll account had enough cash for one more cycle, maybe 2 if Claire froze travel, paused hiring, and begged 3 suppliers for extensions. Richard had ordered her not to use the word crisis. He preferred transition, pressure, and temporary liquidity mismatch. But Claire knew the difference between language and reality. Reality had numbers. Reality had due dates. Reality had a bank officer from Chicago calling twice before breakfast and asking whether the funding confirmation would be signed by noon. Richard moved to the next slide, where a blue upward curve made everything look clean and inevitable. As you can see, he said, our projections remain extremely strong. Malcolm Hayes looked at the screen, then at the printed packet, then back to Richard. The projection assumes full enrollment by September, Malcolm said. Your own internal memo says enrollment is tracking 28% behind schedule. That sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Ethan Cole, the young legal counsel sitting near the windows, looked up so quickly his tablet nearly slid from his hand. David Lawson, the oldest board member, turned his head toward Claire. Richard's smile tightened. Internal memos often lack broader context. Then provide the context, Malcolm said. His voice was not loud. That made it worse. He spoke like a man who did not need volume because he already had leverage. Richard tilted his head slightly. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Malcolm, but there are complexities here that may not be obvious from the outside. It was the kind of sentence that sounded polite until it reached the bones. Angela Brooks closed the folder halfway, then opened it again, her fingers controlled, her eyes fixed on Richard. Malcolm did not react. He simply turned one page in his notes. I am not outside the deal, he said. I am reviewing the company asking us to fund it. Claire felt her stomach drop, because for 1 second the room came dangerously close to the truth Richard had been avoiding all morning. This was not a room full of people choosing whether to accept Malcolm's money. This was a room full of people waiting to be saved by it. But Richard still believed status could outrank survival. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and gave Malcolm the patient expression of a man explaining weather to a child. Let us not turn this into a lecture. We are here to close, not to second-guess the vision. Malcolm slowly placed his pen on the table. The sound was small, almost nothing, but Claire heard it clearly. So did Angela. So did Ethan. Malcolm looked toward the screen again, where the blue curve continued climbing as if lies could rise forever. A vision that cannot answer basic questions, he said, is not a vision. It is a performance. For the first time that morning, Richard's face changed. Not much. Just enough. The room saw it and pretended not to. Outside the windows, Manhattan kept moving, traffic glinting far below, people crossing streets, taxis turning corners, life continuing without any idea that in a conference room above them, a $200 million decision was beginning to move away from the man who needed it most. Richard Whitmore let the word performance sit in the air for half a second, then smiled as though Malcolm had made a charming mistake rather than a dangerous observation. That is a colorful way to put it, he said, and a few executives gave small nervous laughs because they were used to following his cues. Malcolm did not laugh. He sat with both hands resting near the closed folder, his posture calm, his face unreadable, and for the first time several people in the room began to study him more carefully. They noticed what they had missed before. He was not nervous. He was not impressed by the glass walls, the expensive table, or the famous name on the building. He did not lean forward like a man hoping to be included. He sat like a man deciding whether the room deserved him at all. That had always been Malcolm Hayes's way. Long before boardrooms and private terminals, long before bankers returned his calls within minutes, he had grown up in West Baltimore in a narrow brick row house where summer heat pressed through the windows and ambulance sirens were part of the night. His father, Leonard Hayes, drove a city bus for 26 years and died too young after a heart condition went untreated for too long because every specialist appointment cost more than the family could spare. Malcolm was 17 when he watched his mother fold the hospital bill with shaking hands and place it in a kitchen drawer that already held more fear than paper. That was the night he learned that medicine was not just science. It was access. It was money. It was who got listened to, who got delayed, and who got told to wait. Years later, after scholarships, late nights, an economics degree, and a reputation for seeing value where other investors saw inconvenience, Malcolm built Hayes Capital Group with one rule written on the wall of its first small office in Baltimore: capital should not reward arrogance when it can fund dignity. He did not give interviews unless the mission required it. He did not put his face on magazine covers. He preferred to arrive quietly, ask better questions than anyone expected, and leave before people understood how much power had just passed through the room. That privacy was why Richard had failed to recognize him. It was also why the first security guard downstairs had asked Malcolm if he was there for a delivery. It was why a receptionist had pointed him toward the service elevator before Angela corrected her in a tone so calm it made the young woman turn pale. It was why a board assistant had placed Malcolm 3 seats from the end, beside a visitor badge that read guest instead of investor. Malcolm had noticed every detail. Not because he was looking for offense, but because patterns mattered. A company showed its culture in the way it treated people before it knew what they controlled. Back in the conference room, Richard advanced to another slide filled with phrases like strategic expansion and market leadership. Malcolm glanced once at Claire Bennett, and in her face he saw the one thing Richard's presentation could not hide. Fear. Not fear of Malcolm, but fear of the truth finally finding a voice. Angela leaned close enough that only Malcolm could hear her and said, "The bank deadline is still noon." Malcolm gave the slightest nod. Richard saw the movement and mistook it for hesitation. "Good," he said, spreading his hands as if graciously offering a path forward. "Then perhaps we can return to the matter at hand and stop circling questions that my finance team has already handled." Claire's fingers tightened around her pen. Malcolm turned back to Richard, his voice still steady. "Your finance team has handled the questions. You have avoided them." The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. The first silence had been embarrassment. This one was recognition. Something had shifted. The man Richard had tried to diminish was not shrinking. He was measuring the whole room, and every person at that table was beginning to understand that Malcolm Hayes had not come there to be welcomed. He had come there to decide who was worthy of trust. Richard Whitmore had built his career on rooms. That bent around him, and that was why he did not recognize danger when it arrived without noise. For 30 years, he had moved through American business like a man walking across a stage already lit for him, first as a consultant with perfect hair and expensive confidence, then as a healthcare executive who learned that the right words could make investors forgive almost anything. He knew how to say mission when he meant valuation. He knew how to say patient access when he meant market share. He knew how to say inclusion in annual reports while keeping the real circle of power narrow, familiar, and comfortable. People called him visionary because it was easier than admitting he was simply very good at making ambition sound noble. Around him, loyalty was not earned. It was performed. Executives learned to laugh when he joked, nod when he exaggerated, and look away when he made someone feel small. He never used crude language. That would have been too obvious, too risky, too easy to challenge. Richard preferred the polished insult, the delayed handshake, the wrong name repeated like an accident, the little pause before answering someone he had already decided did not belong. It gave him room to deny everything. It let him wound people while leaving no fingerprints. In the conference room, that old habit took over. Malcolm's last sentence had drawn too much attention, and Richard could feel the room slipping from presentation into judgment. He glanced at Claire, then at David Lawson, then at Ethan Cole, reading their faces the way a gambler reads cards. He needed control back. So he smiled wider. "I think we are getting distracted," Richard said. "Our guests may not be familiar with the pace at which companies like ours operate." The word guests passed through the room like a cold draft. Angela Brooks looked up from her notes. Malcolm remained still. Claire finally lifted her eyes, and the look on her face was not agreement. It was warning. Richard ignored it. "We built Veyron from nothing," he continued. "We navigated regulators, markets, hospitals, federal scrutiny, and investor anxiety. That takes a certain kind of experience." He turned slightly toward Malcolm, just enough to make the next sentence personal while keeping it dressed as business. "Not everyone understands that from a distance." Malcolm folded his hands on the table. "Distance can improve vision," he said. "Especially when people inside the building are too close to their own story." David Lawson shifted in his chair. Ethan stared at his tablet without reading it. Richard's jaw tightened, but only for an instant. Then he leaned back, letting out a quiet laugh. You are very confident for someone entering this conversation at the final hour. Angela's eyes narrowed. Mr. Hayes has been in this conversation for 6 months, she said. Richard turned to her with the same smooth condescension. I am sure he has been well briefed. That was the moment Claire knew Richard had crossed from arrogance into self-destruction. She had seen the signature authority documents. She had joined the private call where Hayes Capital's legal team made clear that no wire could be released without Malcolm's personal approval. She had watched Richard skip that call because he said investor process was beneath the chief executive officer level. Now the consequence of that vanity was sitting 3 seats from the end of his own table, calm as winter. Richard clicked to the next slide anyway, but the screen lagged for a second, freezing on the words capital deployment. The delay was tiny, almost harmless, yet it felt like the building itself had hesitated. Malcolm looked at the frozen slide, then at Richard. Before we discuss deployment, he said, I want a direct answer. Did your team withhold the revised trial cost estimate from the funding packet? Claire stopped breathing for half a second. Richard's smile faded at the edges. Outside, far below the glass wall, traffic moved through Manhattan in thin yellow lines, unaware that one honest answer could still save the room, and one more polished lie could end everything. Richard did not answer immediately, and that pause told the room more than his words ever could. He looked first at Claire Bennett, as if expecting her to rescue him with a careful explanation, but Claire did not move. She had protected the company. Through late nights, impossible forecasts, and board calls that ended after midnight, but she would not protect a lie. Richard turned back to Malcolm with a smile that had lost its warmth. The packet reflected the numbers available at the time, he said. Malcolm held his gaze. That was not my question. The air conditioning hummed softly above them. Somewhere near the windows, Ethan Cole swallowed hard. Richard's fingers tightened around the remote. Updated estimates are part of every development process. They shift. They evolve. They are not always material at the moment they are drafted. Malcolm opened the folder in front of him for the first time. The sound of paper moving seemed louder than it should have been. He removed a single page and placed it on the table, turning it so the people nearest him could see the header. Claire recognized it instantly. Internal revised trial expansion budget. Dated 9 days earlier. Marked urgent. David Lawson leaned forward, his face changing as he read the first line. Richard stared at the document, and for one brief moment his confidence flickered. Where did you get that? He asked. Malcolm's voice stayed level. From someone who still believes this company should tell the truth before asking patients, employees, and investors to trust it. No name. No accusation. Just enough to make half the room wonder who had finally refused to stay silent. Richard straightened, trying to turn shock into outrage. This is inappropriate. Internal documents cannot simply be dropped on the table without context. Then add context, Malcolm said. Tell the board why the projected overrun was left out. The room shifted again, not physically, but morally. People who had spent the morning looking at Richard began looking at one another. The old choreography was breaking. Richard sensed it and reached for the only weapon he trusted more than numbers, status. Malcolm, he said, using the first name now as if familiarity could replace respect, you are clearly intelligent. But you have to understand, companies of this size require judgment calls. This is not a community meeting. This is not a classroom. This is a serious board level negotiation. Angela's eyes lifted slowly. Claire closed hers for half a second. Malcolm did not blink. Richard continued, mistaking silence for permission. We do not need emotional reactions clouding a transaction this important. We need discipline. We need people who understand rooms like this. That sentence landed exactly where Richard intended it to land, and everyone knew it. It was not loud. It was not explicit. It was worse. It carried every assumption he had tried to hide under polished language since Malcolm entered the room. Malcolm placed both hands flat on the table and stood. No chair scraped. No voice rose. He simply rose, and the room seemed smaller because of it. "Rooms like this," he said, "are the reason my father waited 6 months for a specialist while men with better insurance were seen in 6 days." Richard's expression froze. Malcolm looked around the table now, not angry, not pleading, but fully present. "Rooms like this decide which medicines get funded, which trials get expanded, which communities get served, and which warnings get buried because the numbers look cleaner without them." Claire's eyes opened. David Lawson slowly removed his glasses. Malcolm turned back to Richard. "So let me be clear. I understand this room very well. I understand the carpet. I understand the view. I understand the language people use when they want power without accountability. And I understand when a company is asking for money it has not earned the right to receive." The screen behind Richard still showed the frozen words "capital deployment." Malcolm glanced at them once, then reached toward Angela. She handed him a slim tablet without a sound. Richard saw it and finally sensed that the meeting had moved beyond persuasion. Malcolm touched the screen once, not sending anything yet, only waking it. A draft email glowed there, waiting. Claire could not read the full message from where she sat, but she could see the subject line, "Funding Decision." Richard's face went pale beneath the conference room lights. For the first time all morning, he said nothing. The tablet in Malcolm's hand became the quiet center of the room, and every person at the table seemed to understand that the next few seconds would matter more than the previous 6 months of negotiations. Richard stared at the subject line as if he could make it disappear by refusing to acknowledge it. Claire Bennett's phone lit up beside her folder, then went dark, then lit up again with another message from the bank. She did not touch it. David Lawson leaned forward in his chair, his face no longer carrying the polite distance of a board member watching someone else's mistake. This mistake belonged to all of them now. Richard finally found his voice, but it came out lower than before. "Let us not be dramatic." Malcolm looked at him. "I agree." The answer unsettled Richard more than anger would have. Malcolm turned the tablet slightly so Angela could confirm the message was ready. She gave one small nod. Richard rose halfway from his chair, trying to recover authority through posture. "You are not going to threaten this company in front of my board." Malcolm's expression remained calm. "I am not threatening your company." He paused, and the entire room seemed to lean toward the silence. "I am declining to fund it." No one breathed for a moment. Richard blinked once, then forced a laugh that sounded too thin to belong to him. "That is not how this works." Malcolm placed the tablet on the table, screen facing upward. "It is exactly how this works." Richard's hand opened toward Claire, demanding support without asking for it. "Claire, explain to him that we have a signed commitment framework." Claire looked at the document in front of her, then at Malcolm, then at Richard. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "The framework is conditional. Final wire authorization remains with Hayes Capital." Richard's face hardened. "That is a technicality." "No," Malcolm said. "That is governance." Angela slid a second page across the table, a clean summary of the final approval chain. At the bottom, under release authority, one name appeared in bold type, Malcolm Hayes. The room saw it at the same time Richard did. Ethan Cole slowly lowered his eyes, as if the legal structure had been screaming the truth all morning and no one powerful had bothered to read it. Richard reached for a calmer tone, but panic had begun to show through the seams. "Malcolm, let us step into my office. We can reset this conversation privately." Malcolm shook his head once. The disrespect was public. The decision can be public too. That sentence ended every remaining illusion Richard had. The chairman of the board, David Lawson, removed his glasses and placed them on the table. "Mr. Hayes," he said carefully, "before any final decision is made, I think the board deserves an opportunity to address what occurred here." Malcolm turned to him, not unkindly. "You had an opportunity when he refused my hand. You had another when he called me by the wrong name. Another when he dismissed my questions. Another when he implied I did not understand the room. Leadership is not what you correct after the money walks away. It is what you refuse to tolerate while the money is still sitting across from you." David said nothing. Claire looked down, not out of shame for herself, but because the words were true. Richard stepped around his chair now, losing patience. "This company employs 1,200 people. Families depend on us. Patients are waiting. You would punish all of them because your feelings were hurt?" For the first time, Malcolm's eyes sharpened. His voice stayed low, but the room felt the weight inside it. "Do not hide your arrogance behind your employees. They deserved honesty from you long before they needed money from me." Richard's mouth closed. Malcolm lifted the tablet again. Angela looked at him, and there was history in that look, years of rooms like this, doors like this, smiles like Richard's, and decisions that had to be made without letting anger drive the hand. Malcolm touched the screen once. The email left the tablet with no sound. But the silence that followed was louder than any alarm. 2 seconds later, Claire's phone vibrated. Then Ethan's. Then David's. One by one, devices around the table lit up with the same message from Hayes Capital Group. The full funding commitment was withdrawn effective immediately. Richard stood motionless at the head of the table, staring at the glowing screens as if betrayal had come from the technology itself. Malcolm buttoned his suit jacket. "You did not lose this funding in the last minute," he said. "You lost it in every moment you believed respect was optional." Angela closed the leather folder and stood beside him. No one tried to stop them. As Malcolm walked toward the door, the wall screen still displayed capital deployment, a phrase that now belonged to a future Veyron would never see. At the threshold, Malcolm paused, not to look back at Richard, but at Claire. "The employees should hear the truth from someone with enough courage to say it," he said. Then he stepped out, and the door closed softly behind him, leaving Richard Whitmore in a room full of people who had finally stopped pretending he was in control. For 7 full seconds after the door closed, no one inside the conference room moved. The message from Hayes Capital Group glowed on every screen like a verdict no one could appeal. Richard Whitmore stood at the head of the table with one hand resting on the back of his chair, his face held in the shape of authority, but the authority itself was gone. Claire Bennett was the first to act. She picked up her phone, read the message once, then opened the banking portal she had been checking since sunrise. At the top of the screen, the pending credit facility review had changed from conditional approval to immediate reassessment. She did not need a lawyer to translate it. The bank had heard enough. "Claire," Richard said, his voice tight, "call Hayes Capital and tell them we need to resume discussions." Claire looked up slowly. "There are no discussions to resume." Richard's eyes flashed toward her. "That is not your decision." "No," she said. "It was yours. You just did not know you were making it." David Lawson rose from his chair, older than everyone in the room but suddenly steadier than he had been all morning. "We need an emergency board session." Richard let out a dry laugh. "Over one investor having a sensitive morning?" No one laughed with him. That was when he understood the room had not merely gone quiet. It had changed sides. Within 1 hour, Rebecca Stone from Communications was standing outside the boardroom with 3 phones in her hands, trying to stop a story that had already started moving. Someone had leaked that Hayes Capital had withdrawn from the deal. By noon, 2 market analysts had posted cautious notes about Veyron's liquidity. By 2 in the afternoon, the stock had begun to slide. At 3:15, the Chicago bank formally froze the credit extension pending updated disclosures. At 4:40, a strategic partner in Boston requested written confirmation that Veyron could still fund its portion of the trial expansion. Claire read the email twice, then forwarded it to the emergency board group with no comment because the absence of explanation was explanation enough. Richard spent the afternoon behind the frosted glass of his office, calling Malcolm directly, then Angela, then Hayes Capital's general counsel. No one connected him to Malcolm. At 5:30, his assistant entered with a pale face and said 3 reporters were waiting downstairs. Richard told her to say he was unavailable. By the next morning, unavailable had become the story. Employees arrived to find television vans across the street and financial headlines questioning whether Veyron had overstated its funding certainty. In the cafeteria on the 12th floor, people whispered over untouched breakfast sandwiches. Some had mortgages in New Jersey. Some had children in college. Some had moved across the country because Richard had promised them they were joining the future of medicine. Now they watched the share price on their phones and saw their future shrink by the minute. 48 hours after Malcolm walked out, David Lawson convened the board without asking Richard's permission. Claire presented the real numbers in a voice that shook only once. 11 days of cash had become 9. The trial overrun was real. The disclosure gap was real. The lost funding was final. Then Ethan Cole, the young legal counsel who had barely spoken during the meeting, stood and added the detail that made the room go still again. The revised cost estimate had not been accidentally omitted. It had been removed from the funding packet after Richard's office requested a cleaner version for investor review. Richard denied intent. Denied wrongdoing, denied everything except the one thing no denial could fix. The money was gone. By the end of the week, vendors were demanding faster payment, employees were updating resumes, and the board had placed Richard on administrative leave. 30 days later, the silver nameplate on his corner office was taken down before sunrise by a facilities worker who had once believed Richard knew everyone's name. He carried it out through the service hallway, wrapped in brown paper, while the lobby screens downstairs no longer played Veyron's mission video. The building still stood. The logo still shone above the front doors. But everyone inside could feel the difference. It was no longer an empire. It was a lesson with elevators. 30 days after Richard Whitmore's nameplate disappeared from the corner office, Malcolm Hayes stood in a very different room on the other side of the country. There was no skyline view, no marble reception desk, no wall of awards arranged to impress visitors before they asked hard questions. The building sat in a quiet industrial park outside Atlanta, 1 story tall, with faded brick, humming fluorescent lights, and a parking lot where employees left their cars between painted lines that had not been refreshed in years. But inside that modest laboratory, Malcolm saw something Veyron had lost long before the money left. He saw purpose. Brookswell Therapeutics was small enough that the founder still changed printer toner when it jammed and answered patient calls when the receptionist went to lunch. Dr. Naomi Carter, a black cardiologist turned researcher, had started the company after spending 12 years treating working families who arrived too late, waited too long, and paid too much for care that should have reached them sooner. Her team was building a low-cost cardiac screening platform designed for rural clinics, community hospitals, and neighborhoods that big companies mentioned in mission statements but rarely visited. The equipment was not beautiful. The desks did not match. A coffee maker near the break room made a tired rattling sound every few minutes. Yet every chart on the wall was honest. Every timeline showed risk clearly. Every budget line had a name beside it, someone accountable, someone willing to answer. Malcolm walked through the lab with Angela Brooks at his side while Naomi explained the data, not with polish, but with conviction. When she came to a limitation, she named it. When she described a delay, she explained why it happened. When Malcolm asked what scared her most, she did not pretend fear was weakness. Scaling too fast with the wrong partners, she said. I would rather grow slowly than become the kind of company that forgets who it was built to serve. Malcolm stopped walking then. For a moment, the lab noise faded behind him, and he thought of his father sitting at the kitchen table in Baltimore, pretending not to worry while medical bills gathered in a drawer. He thought of the conference room in Manhattan, the hand left hanging, the wrong name, the frozen screen, the email that ended one future and opened another. Then he looked at Naomi and saw no performance, no arrogance, no polished language hiding a hollow center. He saw the thing capital was supposed to find when it was doing its job. Trust. 2 weeks later, Brookswell's staff gathered in that same lab, crowded between workbenches and folding chairs while Malcolm placed the signed funding agreement on a metal table. Not a smaller investment. Not a symbolic gesture. The full $200 million, redirected toward a company that had earned belief the hard way. Naomi stared at the document for several seconds before speaking. "You understand what this means for us?" she asked. Malcolm nodded. "I understand what it could mean for the people you are trying to reach." Naomi extended her hand. Malcolm took it without hesitation. No pause. No performance. No one in that room needed to be reminded what dignity looked like when it was treated as normal. Angela smiled quietly from the side, and several employees wiped their eyes because they knew this was not just funding. It was permission to keep going. Months later, while Veyron sold off patents and Richard's interviews vanished from business websites, Brookswell opened its first pilot clinics across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. The first patient screened through the program was a bus driver from Macon who reminded Malcolm so much of his father that he had to step outside for air. That was when he understood the real ending. Richard had thought the meeting was about money. It never was. It was about whether power would keep rewarding the people who confused status with worth, or finally move toward those who still remembered the human being on the other side of every decision. Some men lose everything because the market turns against them. Richard lost everything because he looked at a man's hand and failed to see the future being offered to him.